So socialist tropical medicine was part of a broader vision of healthcare, and in this sense, Eastern Europeans preceded their Western counterparts.
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
Hello, you are listening to the Transformative Podcast of the Research Center for the History of Transformations. My name is Jelena Đureinović. Today, we are discussing socialist tropical medicine. We are talking about its development, purposes, and understanding within Eastern Europe, as well as how East European state socialist countries shaped the assistance to post-colonial states and World Health Organization programs, and also what discourses emerged in this context. My guest today is Bogdan Iacob, who is a historian who works at both the Institute of History of the Romanian Academy of Sciences, as well as the Institute of Habsburg and Balkan Studies at the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna. His work centers on the role of East European experts in international organizations and post-colonial spaces, and he has particularly contributed to the shifting of paradigm in transnational and global history of medicine after 1945, with Eastern Europe in focus, which is also why we are talking about it today. So let's start chronologically. How did the field of tropical medicine and disease control develop in Eastern Europe? How was it linked to post-imperial nation building and later socialist construction?
To start at the beginning, tropical medicine in Europe emerges tied to the consolidation of colonial empires. And the field comes about in the 1890s, first in the UK, and then in the early 1900s across continental Europe. It's connected to the rise of parasitology, bacteriology, and their deployment in the extractivist management of the colonies in Africa and Asia. Tropical medicine, of course, is founded on narratives of racialization that varies from discourses about primitive immunities to certain diseases at the so-called tropics to notions of white fragility before the epidemiological dangers lurking. And of course, these are scare quotes, darkest Africa or teeming Asia, or fears of native degeneration because of perceived inability to overcome their status as carriers of various pathogens. So how does it all relate to the other Europe? Medicine in Central and Southeastern Europe emerged from the scientific milieus that produced tropical medicine. Physicians in the region were trained at imperial schools that treated colonial populations as pathological carriers that require salvation by way of medical modernity. At the end of the 19th century and in the aftermath of World War I, colonial anxieties about indigenous impurity, European cleanliness, and racial degeneration were channeled into nation-building projects in Central and Southeastern Europe. So, first answer to your question would be that tropical medicine is imbricated into the creation and development of national healthcare in what we now call Eastern Europe. The management of diseases formerly assigned a tropical status, such as malaria, cholera, smallpox, became crucial in the healthcare renaissance of nations in this region that we're talking about. Furthermore, medicine was also a tool for internal colonization of these post-imperial states. By way of bacteriology, parasitology, hygiene, medical elites in Central and Southeastern Europe took on the roles, just as their Western counterparts at the so-called tropics, of self-proclaimed civilizing agents, elevating their nations from epidemiological backwardness to the status of healthy, civilized, of course, scare quotes, Europeans. During these processes, the peasantry, ethnic minorities, and internal peripheries became bastions in the fight against infectious diseases. A second answer to your question is more conventional. Tropical medicine as a field in the region emerged during the 1920s and the 1930s at the intersection of Eastern Europe's integration at the League of Nations Health Organization and its component countries' colonial fantasies. So there were two versions, borderlands of European health and simultaneously laboratories for international policies. So generally speaking, the formal emergence of the field, as well as its transposition in nation-state building, were two sides of the same coin. Central and Southeast European elites struggle for their countries to achieve full personhood and modernity in the global racial order, or in plainer terms, to be recognized as equals by their Western European counterparts. And the legacy of this intertwinement between tropical medicine and post-imperial healthcare is fundamental for state socialism for several reasons. First, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. These traditions and these institutions would be recuperated in the 1950s and refashioned as knowledge to assist newly independent peoples, with basically no mention of their colonial background. Second, the knowledge acquired through the League of Nations Health Organization in terms of management of disease among both post-imperial and colonial peoples would be fundamental in the state socialist eradication campaigns and in the socialist experts' ascendance at the WHO. And third, the civilizational superiority and racializing narratives underpinning post-imperial medicine that actually originate in the transposition of tropical tropes would rear their ugly head in discourses about decolonizing countries and peoples. And fourth and last, this long-term genealogy of state socialist medicine would allow its representatives to find common ground and rapprochement with their Western peers during the 1970s and 1980s in a sort of a recentering of Europe.
Our main topic is socialist tropical medicine. So what I want to ask you is there a distinct socialist medicine, and what is socialist about it? How is it different from and connected, obviously, to its Western or liberal or capitalist counterparts?
The socialist experts envisaged the program against so-called tropical diseases as embedded in socioeconomic context and as part of national healthcare planning and infrastructure, not as separate programs, as it was the tradition, for example, in French colonial policy with what were called secteur grand endémie, the sector for major endemic diseases. Or to put it differently, for Eastern Europeans, highly infectious diseases were not only the remit of vertical top-down policies, but also the object for horizontal approaches that involve the entire healthcare system and the entire society. And this recipe was advertised to the Global South and taught to students attending specialization courses at the schools of medicine in the socialist camp. Another socialist approach or socialist specificity, was the broader structural framing of disease. The latter was not only discussed in relation with distinctive etiologies and climates, but also in relation to poverty, disadvantage, discrimination, with a particular focus on the racial aspect of it, and the interrelation between warm climate infections with more common illnesses that in colonial practice were often ignored, and the most notorious cases are tuberculosis and measles, which at one point were considered as diseases atypical for the tropics. And furthermore, as one Soviet expert put it at the First European Congress of Institutes of Tropical Medicine, which took place in 1962, I think, the peoples of Asia and Africa and America need not only tropical medicine, but also maternal and child welfare and general medical practice. So socialist tropical medicine was part of a broader vision of healthcare, and in this sense, Eastern Europeans preceded their Western counterparts. In fact, experts in France, the United Kingdom, or the Netherlands also imagined a wider understanding of tropical medicine in the 1940s and the 1950s as part, on the one hand, of the universalization of healthcare at home and colonial reforms aimed to salvage empires after the Second World War. However, what was called at the time tongue-in-cheek progressive colonialism lost its initial impetus because of economic recession and lingering civilizational and racial prejudices toward peoples in Africa and Asia. So a genuine reform of tropical medicine in the West truly took hold only in the second half of the 1960s, when decolonization had already reshaped the post-war world. Yet we should not idealize the socialist tropical medicine. And this takes us back to your first question. the epidemiological management of the so-called primitive populations or groups deemed bastions of disease, as it had been implemented in Eastern Europe both in interwar and post-war periods. Programs that themselves were transplantations of tropical medical policies were reprojected by socialists into post-colonial context. So tropical distinctiveness exists under the surface of the developmental optimism that drove socialist medicine. And the very fact that oftentimes, especially during the 1950s and the 1960s, socialist experts avoided using terms such as tropics, tropical diseases, and preferred more neutral terms such as warm countries, countries with difficult to bear weather, or highly infectious diseases, this indicates the commitment to developing a distinct approach to the field. Yet the European suprematism lingered, an association of developing countries with the neo-colonial stigma of uncivilization that came with the so-called tropical endemicity.
Was wondering if you could tell me when the East European tropical medicine discourses shifted, or how they shifted from kind of anti-colonial critique of medical essentialization to reproducing the colonial narratives of tropical distinctiveness with the goal of obviously exporting socialist modernity. And this does come out in all your answers until now, the entanglement, the embedded entanglement with the colonial tropical medicine. But still, I was wondering if you could go back to that question separately now as well.
It's very important that you kind of like single out this issue, because it kind of like highlights even more the complexity of our discussion. Because on the one hand, one could say that it's very difficult and tricky to make a clear-cut distinction between anti-colonial discourses versus narratives of tropical distinctiveness and socialist tropical medicine. I think that one can talk about a difference of prevailing attitudes on the ground and of official policy. And tropes of tropical distinctiveness and of pathologization of non-whites existed, as we talked a bit earlier, even at the height of socialist anti-colonialism. And of course, the explanation, as I showed, lies in this long-term history of medicine and of social engineering. However, by mid-1970s, for several reasons, one can remark a growing emphasis of socialist expertise on tropical distinctiveness, in the sense that culturalist, determinist explanations of disease increasingly pop up paired with the regular socioeconomic and clinical explanation. I would give several reasons for this. First, development assistance programs from Eastern Europe to the Global South, as well as public discourse about the possibility of post-colonial development, transforms during this time, with lingering inequalities between European communists and decolonized countries, morphing into racialized points about irreconcilable cultures and mentalities. And tellingly, experts more often than not embrace the term third world in its derogative meaning to point to what they perceived as resilient backwardness, of course, scare quotes. And a second reason is that medical assistance itself becomes commercialized. Tropical expertise becomes a financial asset, not only a political and a humanitarian one. And such financial and developmental distancing between the East and the West facilitates this hardening of geoclinical categories. Third, in 1976, so there is no coincidence that the first Romanian textbook on tropical diseases appears in that year, because that is the year when the WHO begins the initiative of socialist countries, a special program for the research and teaching of tropical diseases. And this new framework creates new opportunities for East-South cooperation, but also new opportunities for East-West exchanges, especially that they were facilitated by detente in Europe. And Eastern European experts compete among each other to pursue partnerships with their Western peers or to obtain fellowships at various tropical medicine institutes in the West. And for instance, Romania had an agreement with Belgium for specialization trips to Antwerp and Laval, and so much so that a Romanian expert dispatched by the WHO to Rwanda to implement higher education in microbiology, he channels his students to Belgium a former colonial metropole during the interwar, rather than Bucharest. So the epitome of this East-West rapprochement is also seen in the growing profile of the European Association of the Institutes of Tropical Medicine, when by the end of the 1970s and during the 1980s, this body is chaired by a Romanian, by a Hungarian, and by a Czechoslovak. There are other Western Europeans as well involved, but during the 1960s, there was very little involvement from Eastern Europeans in this association. Another reason would be the fact that, and I referred to this in one of the answers, that Western tropical medicine experiences rapid transformation during the 70s and 80s, which brings it much closer in terms of its linkage to socioeconomic determinants of disease and broader morbidities of populations in developing countries to the approach in Eastern Europe. But this rapprochement between East and West that explains the centrality, the growing centrality of tropical distinctiveness, can be explained also by the fact that it takes place in a very distant moment in the evolution of, let's say, epidemiological discourses about the world, in the sense that this takes place in the context of the seventh epidemic of cholera that was caused by a strain El Tor that was much more destructive than the, let's say, normal, of course, inverted commas, strains of cholera. And this epidemic starts in 1961 in Indonesia and then washes off across the entire world well into the 1970s. So in Europe and among experts, regardless of ideological division, there is a fear of contagion. And this fear is accelerated by the growing numbers of citizens from the global south that travel to the continent, such as students, experts, guest workers, or in the case of the West, illegal migrants. So tropical distinctiveness reemerges on the background of what I called European securitization beyond the East-West ideological divide. So experts, socialists or otherwise, increasingly focus on brown and black bodies as importers of disease, carriers of exotic pathologies. This is a term that is borrowed from French. Originators of outbreaks of non-endemic diseases, another like coded term for tropical diseases. And so basically what they construct, because they also put it in the context of the population boom in Asia and Africa, they construct this narrative of invasion of booming infectious populations that threaten civilization, white, of course, at home. And another side effect to this tropical distinctiveness is the fact that it encourages knowledge dependency between North and South, in the sense that despite the WHO trying to emphasize developing infrastructures and personnel to deal with so-called tropical disease in the global South, European institutions seek to obtain as much funds as possible to attract as many students as possible. As I mentioned, this whole exchange was commercialized by now. And in this way, tropical distinctiveness has to be maintained in order to justify entire programs that are developed, because medical schools become huge sources of hard currency for communist governments as global South students were paying for their studies.
I have one more question for you for the end, but it's a big question. Why is it important to write state-socialist Eastern Europe into the global history of medicine after 1945?
The first answer would be that inserting Eastern Europe in the story decenters the global history of medicine. It should be clear-cut by now. However, there are other answers that could complicate a bit this very straightforward reply. And first will be that inserting it in the global history of medicine, it makes us think about going beyond narratives of the West and the rest, and then it highlights mobilities, programs, organizations, ideas, and so on and so forth that link various regions of the world in unexpected entanglements, such as the story that I told earlier about socialist Romanians taking up Indian racialization, which then itself adapted colonial racialization that originally had already impacted nation building in interwar Romania. So it's a very interesting story of progression and also simultaneity of historical development. And another answer would be that the story I have told cautions against easy ideological, geographic, and temporal differentiations. If we insert Eastern Europe in the global history of medicine, we are able to counterbalance methodological prejudice and provide more depth to our global interpretation. And lastly, I would say that it also reinserts Eastern Europe in the world histories of colonialism and race, which especially in the context of the rise of illiberalism in the world, but also in the region, it's trying to recuperate the story of coloniality produced within and outside of Eastern Europe is crucial. And I have to note that this has been only a very recent development because, well, for many years, there was a lot of resistance in public discourse and scholarship that still exists today. And you can see it even in peer reviews to articles that deal with these topics.
And this brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you, Bogdan, again for discussing this very large topic with me today. This was the transformative podcast of the Research Center for the History of Transformations with me, Jelena Đureinović, and Bogdan Iacob.